Every year, thousands of organs that could save lives are never used. Despite thousands of potential donors, many vital organs are simply discarded because they can't survive the journey from the donor to the recipient. But one company is trying to change that. Transmedics is changing how organs are preserved and transported so that fewer organs go to waste and more lives can be saved. Their organ care system, or OCS for short, can keep hearts beating, lungs breathing, and livers functioning outside the body for up to 24 hours. And they've been growing their revenue at a rapid pace, even raising guidance 3 times in the same year. In this deep dive, I'll walk you through 3 weeks of deep research so you can decide whether Transmedics is a company worth investing in, adding to your watch list, or walking away from altogether. But before diving into the business model, it's worth asking, why does Transmedics even exist? Over the last few decades, there have been a lot of innovations in both the pre-transplant and post-transplant medicine. But between the donor and the recipient, the most vital phase of the entire process, this still relies on an ice cooler to keep the organs between 0 and 4 degrees Celsius. So while this does help keep organs viable longer outside the body, metabolism doesn't stop entirely, and eventually the organs burn through their remaining energy stores and die unless they're transplanted in time. And with cold storage, each organ has a very specific window of time it can survive outside the body. That window limits how far an organ can travel, and with every hour in transit, more potential matches become impossible. Hearts typically last around 6 hours outside the body, lungs maybe up to 8, and livers are up to 12 hours. And on top of all that, when the organ finally arrives, doctors have no real-time data, no continuous temperature control, no monitoring, no metabolic feedback, and surgeons often have to make the final call by literally looking at the organ. And for a field as advanced as transplantation, that's shockingly low-tech. And this is where Transmedics comes in. Their OCS device replaces ice coolers or static cold storage with warm perfusion. Instead of cooling the organ to near freezing, the OCS pumps warm, oxygen-rich blood and keeps the organ alive in a real sense. Think of it as a portable life support for organs. Now, one of the biggest differentiators that Transmedics brings to the table is its utilization rate. This is its ability to recover organs that normally would have been written off as not viable. And that's not because of the distance or transport time. It's because of who the donor is and how the donation happens. Let me explain. For decades, the pool of potential organ donors has remained surprisingly small. Only those declared brain dead but kept alive on life support were even considered. Think of patients who suffered a brain injury from a car accident. Their brains have completely shut down, but the machines continue to maintain circulation, keeping their organs viable for donation. And behind every one of these cases, there's an entire system, an organ procurement organization, or OPO for short, responsible for identifying, evaluating, coordinating the donation process. Think of them as air traffic controllers coordinating between all relevant parties. But here's the problem. Most patients who die on life support never make it into that system at all. OPOs have traditionally excluded anyone who didn't meet the strict clinical definition of brain death, or DBD, even if they were completely dependent on life support and had no chance of recovery, simply because there was some minimal brain activity that was still detectable. When these potential donors eventually die, they fall under what's known as donation after circulatory death, or DCD. This group actually represents around half of all potential donors, but are significantly underrepresented in donor transplants. So why is that? Let's go back to DBD. In these cases, organs are still being perfused, meaning oxygen-rich blood is being pumped through them, right up until the moment of organ retrieval. That continuous blood flow keeps the tissues alive, prevents oxygen starvation, otherwise known as ischemia, and makes these organs far more viable for transplant. For DCD cases, life support must first be withdrawn. That's both an ethical and legal requirement. And once that happens, doctors wait until the heart stops beating completely. And then they have to observe a mandatory no-touch period, typically around 5 minutes, to confirm that the circulation has truly stopped. And only then can organ recovery begin. This introduces something called warm ischemia. This is when the organs are deprived of oxygen while still at body temperature, and metabolism is still burning through energy reserves at a rapid pace, and every minute counts. Different organs can tolerate that oxygen loss differently. Hearts, for example, are the most sensitive, usually needing retrieval within about 20 minutes. Lungs and livers can sometimes stretch closer to 30 minutes. Kidneys are the most resilient and able to withstand up to an hour before viability drops. So you can see why historically the system favored DBD donors. They had a shorter ischemic window time and produced more reliable outcomes, while DCD donors carried unpredictable warm ischemia times and a higher risk of organ deterioration. And this is where Transmedics OCS platform changed the game. Since 2018, they've been almost single-handedly responsible for the rise in DCD heart transplants, which really expanded the pool of eligible donors. And to put that into perspective, there are around 18,000 transplants in 2024, when we exclude kidney, pancreas, and intestines. And Transmedics accounted for roughly 3,700 of those. That's about a 20% market share with plenty of room to grow. Considering they had a 2% market share in 2020, their growth has been pretty impressive. And DCD donors now account for around 40% of the US donor pool, with potential to surpass DBD donors as awareness grows. And Transmedics has been largely responsible for this gain in DCD volumes by demonstrating that for certain organs like the heart and liver, they can revitalize them outside of the body and deliver better outcomes following transplantation. At this point, you might be thinking, has the ship already sailed? After all, Transmedics stock has appreciated more than 400% since its IPO, and it might seem like most of the upside has already been captured. But this is where the next phase of their ambition comes in. The company is targeting 10,000 transplants in the US by 2028, which equates to around a 40% market share based on my number crunching, and with new targets of 20,000 to 30,000 transplants by 2030 also being set more recently. So is that even possible? Can they reach these lofty targets? Well, one organ that we haven't really talked about much yet is kidney. And if you look at this chart, what stands out to you? Kidney makes up the largest share of all transplants, both in the US and globally. Meanwhile, liver transplants have actually been declining, likely due to improvement in treatments for hepatitis C and B. That means kidneys represent the single biggest untapped organ opportunity for Transmedics. And on top of that, they are preparing to expand beyond the US into Europe and the Middle East. But scaling that kind of growth needs more than just new markets. You need a completely different approach, one that can cut through layers of red tape that would otherwise slow everything down. While the OCS technology was redefining transplants inside hospitals and transplant centers, something else was happening behind the scenes that would transform the company completely. During COVID, with the hospitals and states in lockdown, transplants grinded to a halt, with transplant teams unable to coordinate the logistics for donors and recipients. So Transmedics had to try a new strategy altogether. Otherwise, their business would have grinded to a halt. And what emerged was something really pivotal. This was the birth of their National OCS program, or NOP for short, or as I'd like to call it, Transplant as a Service. Think about how organ transplants traditionally worked. A hospital buys an expensive perfusion machine, trains their own staff to use it, and when they need to retrieve an organ from a donor hospital maybe 250 miles away, they charter a private jet, send their own surgical team, set up the equipment on site, monitor the organ during transport, and hope everything goes smoothly. It's fragmented and it's inefficient, and it forces the hospital to focus on logistics instead of what truly matters, the patient. Let me give you a sense of the scale of what Transmedics has built. They have 17 regional hubs across the United States, 300 clinical specialists trained in organ perfusion, 21 dedicated jets in their aviation fleet, and over 100 pilots providing 24/7 coverage. And here's the thing. In August 2023, Transmedics didn't just contract with an aviation company. They bought one outright. They now have their own entire jet fleet. That matters because ownership gives them full control over schedules and over aircraft utilization, and they're planning to run double shifts on their aircraft, which will increase their transport capacity and push transplant volumes even higher. So let's rewind a bit and look at this from our investing lens. Transmedics used to sell OCS consoles to hospitals for, let's say, $250,000 each, plus disposable kits for every transplant. That's a traditional medical device business model: high upfront capital costs, lumpy revenue, and low recurring income. But under the NOP model, Transmedics owns the OCS devices. Hospitals don't pay anything. Instead, they pay a per transplant service fee that covers the OCS device usage, the procurement, the transport, the logistics, and the clinical monitoring. It's a subscription model for organs. Hospitals get reliable organ logistics and zero operational burden. Transmedics gets recurring revenue with sticky long-term contracts, and they made the service even stickier by tackling one of the toughest problems in the field: dry runs. What's a dry run, you're wondering? Remember how we discussed DCD donors? These are the donors whose hearts are still beating, but life support is withdrawn, and the medical team waits for the heart to stop naturally. The problem is that the heart has to stop ideally before 30 minutes for the organs to be viable, and if it doesn't, then they can't recover these organs. And this happens in about 50% of DCD cases. That's a huge operational cost, but instead of billing the hospitals for the full service, Transmedics only charges around 50% of the normal fee. Now, this might seem like a drag on margins today, but Transmedics is betting that as DCD programs mature and as their data models improve, they'll waste fewer resources on cases that can never materialize, and at the same time, it builds trust with the transplant centers and deters any competitors from trying to enter Transmedics markets. And it doesn't stop there. They're also expanding their NOP capabilities with NOP Connect. It's a digital platform designed to connect every player in the transplant ecosystem. This will provide real-time visibility into organ status during transport and seamless data sharing between hospitals and LPOs. And this evolution right now they're going through actually reminds me of another successful company you might have heard about, Axon, the guys who make the tasers for the police and the body cameras, and they also own evidence.com and upload their body camera footage everywhere. I really love this playbook because Transmedics is doing the same thing, but for organs. They have their hardware, which is the OCS devices, and the software, the NOP Connect, and then they have their services like logistics and clinical support all lumped into one. And companies that operate at this intersection of hardware, software, and services create really incredible customer lock-ins, I believe. And it could act as a huge deterrent for any competitor in this field. And this kind of brings us back full circle into how they're going to potentially break into Europe. Europe has a massive organ transplant problem, but it's different from the US. In America, the challenge was fragmented hospital systems and limited logistics. In Europe, the challenge is many different countries and trying to coordinate organ donation across borders. So in late 2025, or basically now, they're launching their national OCS program in Italy. Although they have sold in Europe before, I believe this is going to be their first proper attempt at trying to expand internationally. And they're showing their intent by building out a full manufacturing facility in Italy as well. And basically, they're planning on replicating this NOP model all over Europe, starting with Italy in the north and south. And as you can see here, they partnered with Mercedes-Benz in Italy to deploy a fleet of purpose-built vans. We'll have to wait and see if this playbook works just as well as it did in the US, but it might become a huge differentiator and a reason for hospitals to choose Transmedics over the more entrenched competitors. And here's a brief look at the timeline they've been operating under and what's planned down the line. You might have noticed something called Next-Gen OCS Lung and Next-Gen OCS Heart. What's that, you're wondering? Before I explain what that is, let's recap a little bit. When the OCS first generation device became commercial, it first had to prove something called non-inferiority. Non-inferiority, that's a mouthful. Meaning it was at least as good as traditional cold storage. And they did that. They published the results in The Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. They ran level 1 randomized clinical trials, which is the gold standard of clinical evidence, and got FDA approval. But here's the thing, for hearts and livers, things progressed really well, but lungs were a different story. Transmedics showed non-inferiority, but they couldn't demonstrate that OCS lung was actually better than cold storage. And for the hardest cases, OCS actually struggled. And this matters because only 20% of donated lungs get transplanted. The other 80% discarded. And doctors are pretty pessimistic about changing that. And that's where the next generation OCS devices come in. The biggest problem with outside the body lung perfusion, or as it's more commonly known as ex vivo lung perfusion, is edema, which is swelling basically. And when you perfuse a lung for more than 6 to 8 hours, fluid accumulates. The lung becomes waterlogged and it can't function properly. This is the Achilles heel of EVLP for short. And Transmedics appears to have solved it in this next-gen OCS version. They've developed a completely new perfusion solution that prevents edema even during 24 hours of perfusion. And data seems to back this up with the next-gen OCS performing similarly to cold storage controls. And really important here is that these lungs weren't actually just less swollen, they were actually healthier than the control lungs and functionally superior. And that's the key word here, superior. And here's what blew my mind when I finally realized it. Transmedics OCS Heart is only FDA approved for DCD hearts and extended criteria DBD hearts, basically the borderline donors that need extra support. But what about the standard DBD hearts that are preserved for less than 4 hours? The easy cases, the short distance transplants. Well, Transmedics does not have any clinical indication for those. That's Paragonix sweet spot. They sell cold storage boxes for short distance heart transports, and they've had a lock on that market for years. But with the next-gen OCS, Transmedics is going after that market. If they can pull this off, and preclinical data suggests they will, Transmedics will have clinical indication for every type of heart transplant: DCD, extended criteria, standard DBD, short distance, and long distance. That's a really sizable market opportunity there, which they can look to expand their market share in lungs and hearts and livers altogether. If the next-gen OCS can achieve these lofty targets, it would open the floodgates for significant revenue growth in the years to come. That's before we even consider their expansion into Europe or their kidney trials as well. So now that we're acquainted with the business, I think it's time to dive into the numbers. The business did $441 million in revenue in 2024 and is on track to achieve $600 million in 2025 based on their recent guidance. So let's break down their revenue segments, and this is divided into their product revenue and service revenue. The product revenue is related to the 3 organs they operate in, while service revenue is made up of their clinical services and their logistics. Now, I think it's important to point out that the service revenue has been growing at a much faster rate than the net product revenue. So why is that? Well, following the acquisition of their own aircraft fleet made up of 21 planes and counting, they've been able to leverage these assets over time by replacing third-party logistics with their own planes. And this has grown from 35% in-house coverage to around 79% as of Q2 2025. This rapid growth has kind of created a one-time leverage effect of service revenue kind of growing way faster than product revenue. But over time, as they approach full fleet utilization, these growth rates will converge. That's why I prefer to look at the total revenue and total transplant volume and analyze a key ratio, which is revenue per transplant instead. And based on that simple ratio, I can estimate that they generate around $120,000 to $130,000 per transplant. And this blended figure for all organs, of course, but it's a useful benchmark. We'll use that for our valuations down the line. And the one thing we haven't actually spoken about much is who's actually paying them. Here's what you need to know. The hospitals are footing the bill, but for the most part, it's usually Medicare who reimburses the hospitals, and also private insurers. Transmedics loves to say this is a win-win-win. A win for patients, of course, who are getting the transplant, a win for insurers and Medicare who reduce their long-term costs, and a win for Transmedics who gets paid for providing a superior service, and a win for the OPOs whose livelihood and funding depends on successful transplant outcomes. And just to briefly touch on Europe, currently the UK and the Netherlands have a national reimbursement for DCD heart transplant using OCS, but most international hospitals are paying for the OCS out of pocket from their hospital budgets or charitable funds. So that's something, again, you have to pay attention to if you're thinking about their expansion in Europe. And jumping back to the numbers, the operating margin has been trending nicely upwards. Now, a few things that can improve upon this figure even more. If Transmedics starts running these double shifts, that means their planes are in the air more often, and the big fixed costs, the aircraft, the maintenance, depreciation, these really don't change. They're already paid for. And yes, there are some variable costs, things like fuel and crew, but those scale linearly. And so now every extra transplant flight is spreading those costs across more revenue. And this leads to margins climbing a lot faster, otherwise known as operational leverage. And as far as the balance sheet goes, in an effort to keep this video short and sweet, I'll be providing some more details of that on my Substack post, and there's a lot more financial details there to offer some more color, as some analysts love to say. So now let's take a look at some of the competitors out there, and they don't charge anywhere near as much as Transmedics' $120,000 to $130,000 price tag. And these competitors vary by the type of technology they're using. So you have things like static cold storage or advanced cold storage, ex vivo lung perfusion, EVLP for short. And we also here in the top left in the purple, we have the NRP, which is the normothermic regional perfusion. And we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that. And as far as costs go, OrganOx, for example, charges $30,000 to $50,000 per transplant, and ex vivo charges around $25,000 to $40,000 per transplant. And this is an ongoing point many bears of Transmedics will make. However, Transmedics will argue that their devices have the highest levels of evidence and the highest success rates and also the lowest complications. And as such, they can afford to charge these prices since they reduce the long-term costs for Medicare and insurers. For example, 35% of kidney transplant patients currently require dialysis post-transplant, which ends up costing Medicare around $90,000 to $100,000 a year of ongoing treatment. Additionally, I think this is potentially a market where the winner takes most dynamic will be most prevalent. When we are dealing in a life and death outcome, how much should Medicare be willing to pay for a life-saving procedure? And yes, it is probably negotiable between Medicare, hospitals, and Transmedics, but I believe there will be a lot of pushback and uproar if it becomes clear that the hospitals were seeking the second best option solely based on price. And this is why I think it was worth spending a lot of time understanding the point of view and differentiation that Transmedics offers. Oh, and just a quick plug, you can find the images of the competitors by organ type and technology on my Substack post. The link is in the description, and there will also be a lot more information that didn't make it into the video for reasons of brevity, and that investors who want to dig in a little deeper will find hopefully a lot of value in. So NRP, that's actually something I did exclude from the competition by organ slide, as it's a bit tricky to place under any one organ. NRP stands for normothermic regional perfusion. But unlike Transmedics' organ care system, this isn't a commercial product. It's not even portable, which is a huge differentiator for Transmedics when you compare it to the competition. It actually started as a makeshift technique adapted from ECMO machines, so the same ones that you use to keep patients alive on life support. And what it does is pretty impressive. It basically allows doctors to convert DCD donors to DVD donors. Yeah, I had to think about that. And this approach started in Europe, and countries like France have now made NRP mandatory for all DCD liver recoveries. And here's the thing, because it wasn't invented by a corporation, it's relatively inexpensive and accessible. The way I like to think of it is it's like open source software for transplants. It's Android for transplants. And it's growing rather quickly in the US as well. So does that mean NRP could replace Transmedics OCS? That's what some bears might argue, and they're claiming NRP costs as little as $4,000 to $10,000 per case compared to Transmedics $120,000 or whatever number they have. But Transmedics has pushed back hard on that comparison. Here's why. An NRP case still requires 2 dedicated surgeons and perfusionists. I'm not sure why you need dedicated surgeons for this, but I'll give them this one. They also need specialized disposables and a method of transport like Paragonoc's Sherpa Pack, which would cost them $20,000 per organ. And don't forget the dry runs, which aren't reimbursed like Transmedics, which add up as a hidden cost. But the real light bulb moment for me here was when I realized that one NRP procedure could potentially recondition all organs from a single donor, spreading the cost across multiple organs. Whereas the OCS, each organ requires its own device, which would total over $250,000 for multi-organ recovery. So does converting a DCD donor to a DBD-like state reduce the need for Transmedics? Possibly. But Transmedics' core value proposition is that the OCS delivers better outcomes than even standard DBD procedures on ice. If they can prove that, then there's nothing to argue over. But it's not all doom and gloom. NRP and OCS are not mutually exclusive, meaning they can work together synergistically. We've established that the two technologies serve different purposes, and studies are now showing that they can be used sequentially. A donor's organs can be reconditioned with NRP and then placed on an OCS for transport. This could offer the best of both worlds, the early recovery benefits of NRP combined with the extended preservation and transport advantages of OCS. And now to change direction, let's talk about the short report that came out in January of this year. That was a full 342 pages of it, claiming that Transmedics is a complete fraud. And these aren't just your average short sellers. These are activist short sellers who are actually petitioning the FDA to suspend Transmedics devices. Now, I'll be honest, the language in the report feels really unprofessional and frankly a bit racist. I mean, walk like an Egyptian? Come on, like, why? But here's the thing, short sellers are usually smarter than your average investor, so it's worth taking into account what their allegations are. According to the short sellers, it's used purely to avoid 2 a.m. surgeries and shifts the procedures to daytime hours, basically making the surgeons' lives more convenient because, they're usually on call any time of the day or night. My first thought was, so what? I mean, having surgeons that are at their peak performance may in itself lead to better clinical outcomes. And if the device can, in fact, afford the improvements in offering daytime surgeries without any significant detriment to the organ or patient, then there's no issue. Another allegation was regarding the aircrafts they bought. The short sellers are arguing that Transmedics is overusing these planes for short distances unnecessarily, leading to massively inflated bills to the hospitals. Well, this chart seems to show the opposite is true. Transport distances seem to be increasing overall, and this point about transport distance really ties into the Medicare reimbursement cap. See, Medicare usually caps spending on procedures, but for transplants, there is no cap. As long as the costs are deemed reasonable, Medicare reimburses everything. So Transmedics can essentially charge whatever they want, and Medicare foots the bill, essentially. And my opinion on this, with the advantage of time, is that if some of these allegations were true, we would have seen the consequences of these big accusations by now. We would have seen some sort of binary outcome with Transmedics, but nothing has materialized. And so you might have thought that Scorpion Capital, the short seller, was done with their short, but more recently it seems like Scorpion Capital is back just ahead of earnings, which actually happened on 30th of October, with a different thesis, saying that Organox and Bridge to Life are coming to eat Transmedics lunch. Shouldn't it be more the case that the FDA and Medicare are going to come in and eat Transmedics lunch and halt these extortionate and fraudulent behaviors? Anyways, I'll leave it at that. And now as we're wrapping up, let's take a look at the key metrics to watch for this company. At this point, you should have a pretty good idea on what to keep an eye on. Utilization rates, DCD versus DVD volumes, and the donor pool size, the organ market share, NRP with OCS versus NRP alone, how the next-gen OCS trials are coming along, and lastly, you can take a look at the flight data. There's this fantastic Transmedics flight tracker built by Singularity Research that I'll leave a link for in the description. They provide revenue estimates based on the flight data, and it's really useful for getting a sense of the revenue beats for the next quarter if you want to get ahead of things. But as they enter Europe and the use of more ground transport, it may become less useful or accurate over time. Now let's briefly talk about the risk, because with Transmedics, most of them are pretty much binary outcomes. Either Medicare caps reimbursements or it doesn't. If it does, you can kiss your investment goodbye, or at least expect a serious collapse in the stock price. Another binary outcome, their next-gen OCS trials fail. If they don't get those new indications, it limits how many donors and organs they can access. That growth story then suddenly hits a wall. Third, the FDA pulls the plug on existing use cases. Maybe it's because of off-label use or something sketchy in the field. And then you've got your longer tail events, such as xenotransplants with pig hearts, or genetically modified organs, or you could have AI, come up with a solution for medical care and medical expenses that, renders transplants obsolete. There's a list of other more obvious risks, but these are the big ones that stand out and the ones that could flip the story overnight. And on to the valuation, the juiciest bit that you all probably skip to since you know everything anyways, right? So let's take a look. So I want to let you know that I'm going to be talking more directionally than precisely about the valuation in the video, and to help understand what the key revenue drivers are. For more details on the discounted cash flow valuation, which I have compiled with every single revenue driver considered, from DCD to DBD organ growth to organ market share and organ utilization, you can find that in the Substack. For the number files, I also ran Monte Carlo simulations, taking into account all these variables, and came up with a lovely price target as well. So yes, please do go check it out, and the link is in the description. To get everyone up to speed, if you haven't realized this yet, there are many value drivers in this business, sort of like a Russian doll within another one. But to put it simply, it looks something like this. You have the total donor pool that needs to grow. This is akin to the total addressable market if you're aware of TAM, SAM, and SOM diagrams. Then the smaller doll is the donor utilization rate, meaning that for every donor, how many organs can be retrieved for transplantation, i.e. that's the utilization rate, right? That figure is improving and is another subdriver of the growth in organ transplants. And lastly, you have Transmedics market share of those organs, and how many of those potential organs do they then go on to service with their devices. So that's in essence what you need to consider if you want to value this business. So where does that leave us in terms of valuation? I feel I've been fairly realistic regarding what I think are important milestones for this business. I think they'll be able to grow their market share, and donor utilization will also improve over time, assuming their next-gen OCS devices also deliver on their promises. But even with my best estimates, I can't hit their 2028 target of 10,000 transplants. But I do hit that target in 2028 when I do consider European revenue. But they explicitly said they didn't factor that into their 10,000 transplant target. Additionally, they are way more optimistic than I can be about the growth of the donor pool. Still, with all the number crunching, I get an implied fair value of around $272. That's about a 16.5% rate of return, based on today's price of $130. But to put that into perspective, this median price target requires revenue to grow at an annual compounded rate of 20 to 22% for 10 years. Is that reasonable, you ask? And this is where I go to take a look at the work of Michael Mobison's base rate data, which was published during his time at Credit Suisse. And we need to compare Transmedics to a group of its peers. And this is historical peers, looking at all companies that were growing revenue around $600 million. That would place it in the top right corner here, as this range is between $450 to $700 million. And what does this tell us? Only 2% of companies of similar size have achieved this phenomenal feat over 10 years. Whether Transmedics joins this elite club remains to be seen. You need to be an optimist to handle all the uncertainties that lie ahead, and I think I've laid out the case of how they can achieve this roadmap in the future, matching the stories to the numbers. If you found this video helpful at all, or dare I say enjoyable, could you let me know down in the comments below, or even tell a friend who is going to lose his mind with some of my valuation numbers. And if you're crazy enough to put yourself through this again, you can watch one of my other videos on the channel somewhere here. Until then, I'll see you in the next video.